Time for us to start talking about the process of mitosis and the cell cycle. Every single cell in our body undergoes a cell cycle and subsequently the process of mitosis. Within the cell cycle, we first have 4 phases. The first phase is known as the G1 or gap 1 phase. The second phase is known as the synthesis phase or the S phase. The third phase is known as the gap 2 or G2, and then the final phase is known as mitosis. In the gap 1 phase, the cell basically stops and checks to make sure that the cell is ready to undergo the synthesis phase. In the synthesis phase, the cell replicates DNA. So you go from having 1 copy of DNA to 2 copies of DNA. This is crucial for the process of mitosis because what's going to happen is you're going to have 1 copy of DNA will go to one daughter cell and a second copy of DNA will go to the other daughter cell that's produced by mitosis. The G2 or the gap 2 phase is used by the cell to make sure that everything is ready to undergo mitosis. And then finally, we have the process of mitosis or the M phase. Let's break down mitosis and look at the different phases within mitosis. The first phase of mitosis is known as prophase. Now in prophase, what happens in our cell is that the nuclear membrane dissolves and the chromosomes start to tightly coil so we can actually see them. If you've ever seen pictures of chromosomes, a lot of times what you see is them tightly coiled and you see an X. Now this X is made up of 2 copies of DNA and they're identical. This is 1 copy here and this is the second copy here. These were made during the process of synthesis. Let's look at a cell with 4 different chromosomes. The next step in mitosis is metaphase. Now in metaphase what happens is our chromosomes line up on the equator and they start to get ready to divide. We also have spindle fibers which have connected themselves each to 1 copy of every chromosome. The next phase is when the chromosomes start to get pulled apart by these spindle fibers. So the spindle fibers are pulling them apart to the different poles. This is known as anaphase. And then finally, we have telophase. Now in telophase, the chromosomes get pulled completely apart to the different poles by the spindle fibers. And then the cell gets ready to undergo the process of cytokinesis. This is where the cell actually splits and goes from 1 cell to 2 daughter cells. The key to mitosis is the fact that the 2 daughter cells are completely identical to the initial cell that you started with. You start with 4 chromosomes. Granted, they're 2 identical copies of each chromosome, but 4 different chromosomes in your first cell. And what you end up with are 2 daughter cells with 4 chromosomes at the end. That's key. If you've ever cut yourself, if your body on a regular basis always uses mitosis to produce blood cells, your body uses mitosis all the time. And the idea is that you want to end up with cells that are identical to the ones you start with. So again, if you cut yourself, your body has to heal and it uses a process of mitosis. Blood cells are made every single day and you want them identical to the cells, the parent cells, so you use the process of mitosis. So that's one good reason that we should care about mitosis. But what's another one? Well, unfortunately, many people are all too familiar with the process of cancer. Cancer is basically mitosis gone awry. It's mitosis where it just doesn't stop. Mitosis, despite what it may seem, is actually a very carefully controlled and regulated process. There are actually genes and proteins and such that inhibit mitosis and keep it from happening until it's needed. You don't want your body just producing cells left and right if you don't need them. But what happens with cancer is you get a mutation in some of these genes and it doesn't suppress the process of mitosis anymore. So you start getting a buildup of more cells and more cells and more cells and more cells, and these are cancer cells. And ultimately this can be fatal. So a simple mutation or a buildup of simple mutations can actually cause mitosis to no longer be able to control itself, and it just goes crazy and makes too many cells. Hopefully this has given you a good idea as far as why we should care about mitosis, as well as a good rundown of the cell cycle and the different stages that are involved. Our next lecture will involve the process of meiosis, which is a complementary process that's also incredibly important to our survival. Hello everyone, it's now time for us to talk about the process of meiosis. If you recall earlier, we talked about mitosis, which happens pretty much everywhere in the body. Alternatively, meiosis only happens in one place and only produces one type of cell, gametes. Meiosis happens either in the ovaries of females or in the testes of the males. Another main difference between meiosis and mitosis is the fact in meiosis you end up with two daughter cells that have half the number of chromosomes as what you started with in the parent cell. And that's actually really important because if you think about it, when you have an egg and a sperm get together and you form a zygote, which will eventually turn into a baby, you have to have the exact right number of chromosomes. Too much information or too little information are most of the time fatal. In meiosis, there are several other different key steps. First of all, in the process of prophase 1, your chromosomes start to coil up to produce those X's again, but you also start to have what are known as your homologous chromosomes pairing up. What is a homologous chromosome? Well, within organisms that are considered diploid, meaning you have two copies of like chromosomes, each copy that will pair with its mate. So these copies are based on shape and on the genes that are found within them. You get one copy of chromosomes from your mom and one copy of chromosomes for your dad. And in prophase 1, these homologous pairs start to pair up together. Then, in metaphase 1, these pairs line up on the equator, like so. You then have anaphase 1, where the spindle fibers grab onto your chromosomes and start to pull your X's apart. And then we have telophase 1, whereby you end up with your chromosomes, homologous chromosomes, being split. Your pairs are split. It's incredibly important to note that at this particular stage, when you begin, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 different chromosomes. Remember, half of these chromosomes came from your mom and half of them came from your dad. And these are going to actually split. And what you end up with in your daughter cells, after you undergo cytokinesis, is half that number. So we started out with 4, and we ended up with 2 in each of our daughter cells. This particular stage is known as reductional division. Because you reduce the number of chromosomes you have within each of your cells. You start out with 4 in this example and you end up with 2. Then each of these daughter cells is going to undergo a second round of meiosis, known as meiosis 2. The first part is known as meiosis 1, and the second one is meiosis 2. In meiosis 2, again, we have prophase 2, where our chromosomes are coiled up. We then have metaphase 2, where the chromosomes are lined up on the equator and they get ready to divide. We have anaphase 2, where the chromosomes get pulled apart and start to travel to each of the poles. And then we have telophase 2, where our chromosomes are pulled apart and at the opposite poles. And finally, we undergo cytokinesis, where the cells split. This happens in every single daughter cell. So it happens in this daughter cell and it happens again in this daughter cell. So what you end up with are 4 different daughter cells, each now having 2 chromosomes. In this case, we started out with 2 chromosomes, 1 and 2. Remember, these 2 are identical to one another. We end up with 2 chromosomes in our daughter cells, 1 and 2. So this is known as equational division. Because it's equal. You start out with 2 and you end up with 2. What happens from this point is that these cells will then go and form gametes. In the male, these will form sperm. In the female, any one of these, will be chosen to form the egg, and the others along the way will tend to be discarded as waste. Females only produce 1 egg through the process of meiosis, whereas males will produce 4 sperm. Hopefully this has given you a good idea of the process of meiosis and why it's important. Without it, we wouldn't be able to reproduce and have children.